Hey everyone, I decided this week to keep on the topic of racing games for one more video if that's okay. Technically this video has to do with games in general, but the examples I'm using are racing games. Hopefully you don't mind that too much. So what is the topic of this editorial anyway? You saw the title card and might be confused as to how language relates to games at all, let alone racing games. Well, today we're actually looking at the language of play, and how developers can go about teaching their players how to play while still providing fun and a gradating challenge for them. If I were to ask you what kind of racing games you find the hardest, many of you would probably say sim racers. And for good reason. The language they use for play is vastly different from the language arcade racers use. Arcade racers speak to the player in ways a lot more akin to normal games in other genres. They're focused on the big picture and tend to be very forgiving of input mistakes. They usually don't want you to get caught up in the minutia, and instead try all they can to keep you pushing forward. As such, the learning curve starts rather low, allowing for people to jump in fairly comfortably, no matter what their skill level. Arcade racers use things I described in the grid review heavily, like rubber banding and assists that can't be fiddled with. They break the rules of reality, usually to deliver an exaggerated but thrilling look at racing. Sim racers, meanwhile, do the opposite. Playing a sim racer is like playing Arma, where you're going to face rather severe consequences for little mistakes. These games revel in the tiny details that other games try to completely iron out of the experience. As such, the barrier to entry can quickly become astronomical. You've sometimes got 500 plus cars that all handle completely differently, and each of them have differences you might not even be able to notice without experience, but that can alter the outcome of a race in its entirety. This way of playing the game is very different from arcade racers on a fundamental level, which is why it's important for developers in this genre to heavily focus on getting people to understand the language of play. And yet, the amount of genuine help these games offer is often shockingly slim. As if it ruins their street cred by going easy on new players, sim racers are almost exclusively cold and unfeeling to people who don't understand their mechanics. All too often they just leave players out in the rain, expecting them to learn everything themselves or give up trying. Much like hardcore fighting games, new players of sim racers therefore tend to not stick around for very long. The games rarely give the player enough help to get them to stay interested, leading to them leaving rather quickly. If someone can somehow get past the brick wall though, these developers usually have a fan for life. It's a really risky business decision, because it makes it hard to replace customers with new ones if they eventually stop playing. With all that being said, there is one series I know of that actually takes an extremely intelligent approach to teaching their language of play. You probably know it since it's the biggest sim racing series ever, as well as being the best-selling Sony exclusive ever. Yes, of course I'm talking about Gran Turismo. For the sake of this editorial, I'll be comparing Gran Turismo to Forza. Keep in mind that I'm not singling Forza out for any reason other than that it's the only other sim racer that's easy for me to get footage for. As much as I still think Forza can grow to teach its players way better, it still does a better job of it than most games in the sim racing genre. So most of my comparisons apply to sim racers in general, not just Forza. So what the heck is so great about the way Gran Turismo does its teaching then? Why do I think it's the best when it comes to not just translating its language, but teaching it to you? That's an important distinction, by the way. Well, to begin, let's look at Forza to see what sort of things the average sim racer does to help its players out. Some sim racers apply some sort of rubber banding to their games. This is ridiculous. I myself am completely against rubber banding as a whole, unless it's a more complex form. Making cars get faster or slower in order to keep the pack close is far too noticeable, and ends up feeling excruciatingly cheap. When you're far behind, it feels like the game is throwing you a pity party, with wins often being a frustrating grind, where you feel like your skills aren't being showcased since the opposition is always right behind you. There are other forms of rubber banding though. Mario Kart employs its power-ups as rubber banding. Blue shells and other powerful items can only be gotten when you're far behind, and support the chaotic and silly nature of the game in the process. Even though they are basically handouts for people who are losing, they're integrated into the systems already at play. You feel lucky that you got that item. Meanwhile, while it's extremely difficult for most people to avoid the negative effects of these power-ups being used against them, it is possible to avoid them. You can indeed stop a blue shell in multiple ways, but they're usually risky and difficult. It does make it harder for top players to lose their opposition, but it's not at all impossible in most versions of the game. This leads to them truly feeling great and rewarded when they win, because it was their skills that got them through. Another form of rubber banding would be raising and lowering the AI difficulty dynamically during the race. Forza 3 and onward do this to some extent. They allow you to pressure AI opponents into making mistakes by driving aggressively. Admittedly, this is a bit silly looking though, since the AI will often just suddenly decide not to brake for a corner at all. But it can be effective. The only other thing most sim racers do for new players is give them assists to turn on and off. Many of these assists are real systems placed on real cars, like traction control and anti-lock braking. Others are fantastical, like Gran Turismo's Skid Recovery Force, which tries to help correct your car when you start to spin out, or Forza's auto braking system, which basically hits the brakes for you when you get into a corner. But all of these are ancillary assists. They do nothing to actually teach the player, but rather simply just put a buffer between their skill level and what the game expects of them. They make up for your faults. Forza itself has one more major assist that I'm willing to bet they ripped straight from Grid, and they made even more forgiving. This assist is the rewind function. Starting in Forza 3, players have the option anytime during a race to rewind and try part of that race again. Now, unlike Grid, they can't choose exactly where they start from, with the system rewinding usually to set sections of the track. But also unlike Grid, players can rewind much further most of the time, as well as rewind an infinite number of times during a race. You aren't limited to a certain amount of flashbacks, so you can make as many mistakes as you want. Again though, this is an ancillary assist. It can help the player get better through practicing something like a particularly difficult pass, but it isn't intended to teach the player, it's intended to fix their mistakes. One other thing Forza did, up until the most recent games, is make the tracks wider than they are in real life. This was done with the intention of making passing easier during online play. But not only would a lot of people argue that this goes against the core of what makes a sim racer, it also leads to the corners all feeling much more like sweepers. Compare this footage of the Nürburgring on Gran Turismo to this footage of the same course on Forza. Notice how much more flow Forza's version has, and how much more smooth it is? It feels more like a roller coaster than a racetrack, and nearly every turn feels identical to the last. So in the end, this assist that was meant to make playing the game easier ended up affecting nearly everyone negatively by scrubbing away the identity of a lot of tracks. Now what makes Gran Turismo different? Every numbered Gran Turismo release since the very first game has had a little something known as license tests. Now many of the hardcore fans dislike these tests, since they gate progression by requiring that you complete all of the tests for a given license before you can do races in that category. So if you want to do an International A ranked race, you have to first have the International A license, but you also have to have every license before that one as well. If you already know how to play the game well, it's understandable that these can feel like distractions getting in your way. I personally love the license tests, but I digress. In the end, the license tests are actually an extremely important part of the Gran Turismo formula, and I believe they are the reason the series is so successful. So what exactly is a license test? Well, most of them are very short and simple tasks, aimed at teaching a player a very specific skill they'll need while playing the game. They usually start off simple, with things like 200-meter sprints, followed by the need to brake in a designated area. The tests start to get more complex later on, with challenges like tackling blind corners at high speeds, navigating chicanes in the rain, comparing handling characteristics when various assists are on and off, and even full hot laps of a track, or tests teaching you the basics of other forms of racing, like special conditions racing. These tests are not only well paced, but the times required to get bronze, silver, and gold are almost always spot on for the different skill levels. It's rare for a player to get completely stuck on a license, but if they do, that means they're missing a skill that will likely be required as the races get tougher. These tests also do a great job of assisting the player in their learning. They each come with their own written explanation of the techniques being taught, and the newer games even have completely different audio explanations to give you yet more information on top of what's already written. They often allow you to turn the driving line on or off, as well as occasionally alter some assists. On top of all of this, they even come equipped with replays of a person completing the test correctly, that can even be turned into ghosts that you can follow when doing the test yourself. You have so many options for how to learn the techniques being taught, and the difficulty climbs gradually so that often people won't even realize they're getting better until they're suddenly wasting old lap times from when they first started. I can tell you from first-hand experience that these tests work well. I was the type of kid that only played arcadey car games for the most part. I'd much rather have been playing games like Twisted Metal or Mario Kart most of the time. That is, until two things happened. The first thing was that I played Driver, which had much more demanding physics than anything else I'd played before, but they were still enjoyable, and I couldn't quite pin down why. The second thing was that I realized Gran Turismo had some of my favorite cars in it. It's really that simple. When I first played Gran Turismo, I hated it though. I played the demo for Gran Turismo 1 on a PlayStation Underground disc I got with my PS1, and I could never, ever get first. I'd played the full versions of GT1 and 2 a few times before I got a PS2, and borrowed Gran Turismo 3 from a friend. It had so many cars to pick from, and there was an issue of tips and tricks that showed you how to break the physics so that you could get a car to go over 800 miles an hour. I wanted to do that, so I started playing. I just didn't get it, however. Somehow it didn't compute that I actually had to use the brakes, and I didn't understand why the cars wouldn't turn. Everything understeered like a monster compared to the games I was used to playing, and it felt impossible to play. Eventually, I got enough third-place wins on Super Speedway in the Sunday Cup that I could upgrade my Miata and get first place just by holding the gas and coasting along the walls. I then did that around 40 times, until I got enough money to buy a late 90s Camaro. After that, I ended up spending most of my time simply overpowering my opponents, since everyone else was still driving 90 horsepower economy cars at that point. But there was a limit to that, because eventually I needed to get the National B license to do more races. I really struggled with those tests at first, but damn if it didn't change everything. I likely would have dropped the game and never touched it again if those tests weren't there. I quickly would have hit a wall where it got too expensive to buy faster cars that could just waste my opponents on power alone, and I would have refused to do all the grinding that it would require to get even quicker cars. Now granted, I was a kid. I'm sure adults found it easier to pick up the skills needed to play those games, but still, even today I'm learning new things and improving every time I do these license tests. They're actually my favorite part of the series, because I like how I can get better at the game while doing fun little bite-sized challenges. But Gran Turismo doesn't stop there. Even outside of the license tests, the games include tons of different events that specialize in forcing you to execute specific techniques. GT4 has slipstream challenges requiring you to draft behind your opponents as much as possible to gain the speed you need to pass them. It also has passing challenges called one-lap miracles, where you start the race quite a bit later than your much slower opponents, and have to successfully pass them all in a single lap without hitting any of their vehicles. Gran Turismo 5 has events specifically designed to teach you one of the most infamous tracks in the world, the Nürburgring, otherwise known as Green Hell. It even has events geared toward teaching you NASCAR, and ones that show you how to tackle the Top Gear test track, which is a figure-8 track that crosses over itself in the middle, leading to the possibility of high-speed collisions with opponents at the intersection. Gran Turismo 6, as well as a few of the other games, has what it calls coffee breaks, which are fun little exercises that attempt to refine small skills. They have cone challenges where you're supposed to avoid every cone to get to a designated area in a certain amount of time, cone challenges where you're supposed to hit every cone as quickly as possible, and even economy trials where you're given a very small amount of gas, and you have to be as stingy with it as possible in an attempt to make it as far as you can before the car runs out of fuel. GT6 also added an update several months ago that gave us the Sierra Time Rally, which is an event that gives you points based on how fast you can complete a rather large course, while passing as many opponents as possible, which raises your points multiplier. But if you hit an opponent, you lose that multiplier. It also came with both the ability to simulate driving the course at the Goodwood Festival of Speed, and even simulate driving a moon rover on the damn moon. But even beyond all of that, the game even hosts what it calls the GT Academy trials every year. In these events, players compete for the chance to get on the GT Academy reality television show, where they then go through a series of real-life challenges to prove that they're worthy of being a real race car driver. The winner gets to drive for Nissan, just proving that the skills set before us in this game truly do teach you a lot of the real-life skills necessary to be a professional racer. These sort of things don't exist in most other sim racers in any capacity, which really makes GT unique within the genre. And all of these can help teach a player how to play their game better. It's teaching them their language of play. That's not to say that games like Forza don't beat it out in one or two capacities. Gran Turismo has no difficulty options, whereas Forza has several of them for different skill levels. It also gives you bonus cash for turning off assists and raising the difficulty, incentivizing the act of challenging yourself. But again, there's no direct teaching going on. The games do very little outside of buffering things for less skilled players. Where Gran Turismo tries to teach you the language of the game, and the skills required to play it, Forza simply translates its language, adapting it to an arcade style of play. Most sim racers hardly even do that. Forza dumbs itself down so that you could try to play it like an arcade game, but as such, it prevents players from getting any better without bashing their heads against a brick wall. It can also develop rather bad habits that make learning even more difficult. As such, one could argue that the new players are not really playing it as a sim racer, but rather as a somewhat bastardized form of an arcade racer. And I'm not sure that's the best way to train up and therefore retain new players.